This is part 2 of the lecture on ecosystem diversity and change, and this part is about natural selection and its effects. So first off, we ended last lecture talking about survival of the fittest, and these are 3 common myths about evolution through natural selection. Like we had said previously, the fittest is not necessarily the strongest, so that's a common myth. Remember that fittest means reproductive success. Those organisms who are able to pass on their genes are the ones who are the fittest in their population. Organisms do not develop traits out of need or want. For example, giraffes with long necks were better adapted to their conditions, and so they were able to pass on more genes. Just the fact that the trees were tall and the giraffes wanted the leaves was not the cause for the long neck. Likewise, our skin, just because the ozone layer is getting thinner, our skin will not magically prevent us from getting skin cancer. And the last myth is that there would be some grand plan in nature for perfect adaptation. There is no perfect adaptation. Conditions constantly change. There's no master species. There's no perfect plant. Everything has to change. And genetic variation is one of the most important principles in making sure that each species persists. There are limits to adaptation through natural selection. First off, the genetic change must precede the change in the environmental conditions. You can't change your genes just because the environment changed. Again, like our skin, we can't just get tougher skin to prevent cancer because the ozone layer got thinner. That change has to be there already. Some people who have darker skin are already predisposed to have more resistance to skin cancer. The genetic change has to precede the change in the environment. We are also limited by our reproductive capacity. Remember that little r for biotic potential. The faster you can reproduce and go through generations, the quicker you can adapt to change because you're passing on those selected traits much quicker. So bacteria and cockroaches adapt quickly, while elephants, sharks, and humans take thousands or millions of years. And this would explain the reason why bacteria and cockroaches are so good at surviving and why we found out that cockroaches can eat anything, live anywhere, and survive pretty much any sort of nuclear holocaust that we can think up for them, because they are able to adapt very, very quickly because their reproduction, their time between generations is so fast. This little animation is going to show you the basic principle behind the peppered moth idea. What we are going to be looking at here is a bird that is hunting for moths. So as I click start, we see that these are it's a dark colored tree. And what you see here is that the bird is more easily able to spot the light moths. I'm really bad at hunting. You can see the other ones, but just not nearly as well. And so over time, when we look at the left-hand side, you can see that I ate 19% of the light moths, but only 5% of the dark moths. So the genes for the dark moths are going to pass on at a much higher rate. If I do the other extreme for tree color, you can see that it's way easier to see the dark colored moths. The light colored moths are still there, there's one. The dark moths are way easier to find. And so it's a better idea to use my time as a predator to go after those dark colored moths. And this was the idea behind the peppered moth in England. There's been some scientific debate recently that has overturned the original thinking, that was that as the trees began to gather pollution, that then the trees turned darker, and so the moths likewise were able to survive better if they were darker. There's now evidence that there's a lot more to do with the chemicals that were in the air than just the tree color. Because certain types in a species will be more suited to pass on their genes, we have three generalized effects on selection. So what we're going to see here is what will happen if a population is faced with a new environmental change and how the genes, the genotypes, will shift. And so the three types here are directional, stabilizing, and disruptive. Now in this first example, you have directional selection. And so it tells you what happens here. Allele frequencies shift in one direction. And this would be like that peppered moth demonstration that we just did. If, for example, we have a dark colored tree because of pollution or because of any other change in environmental conditions, then the normal distribution for the peppered moth, which is a bell-shaped curve, is over time going to shift. The lighter colored moths fare much worse. The dark colored moths fare better. So that over time we have seen a shift in the curve towards the extreme end. So we go in one direction. This is called directional selection. We've already done a peppered moth simulation. Stabilizing selection. In this selection, the intermediate form, the very, very middle, is favored. And so what we end up seeing is the disappearance of these end values, and our bell-shaped curve has become a very, very small, high in the middle curve. And so we don't have a very broad base here, but most organisms are born smack in the middle. The example the book gives is birth weight in humans. And if we think back, especially before modern medicine, it was the case very often that if your baby was born too small, it was premature. They didn't have the lung capacity to survive without modern medicine. On the other side, if a baby was too large, it could have had gestational diabetes, or there could have been birth complications that might have led to its death or the mother's death. And what we end up with then is that most babies are born around 6.5 to 7.5 pounds. That's more like a global average. In suburbs where people tend to be upper middle class, we have a little bit larger babies because we're better fed and we have better medicine, better care. But generally we would say that the average size of a baby is about 6.5 to 7.5 pounds. So this is an animation for stabilizing selection. In this last form of selection, what we see is a genotype disruption. And in this example, forms at both ends are favored and the intermediate forms are selected against. What we might have here is a population that divides up its niche so that we have a daytime and a nighttime feeder, and that would explain why one population of the butterflies or the moths would want to be light in color, while the other population would be dark in color. When this occurs, when this disruptive selection occurs, we are going to most typically see two species develop where one did exist. Because from what we know from basic biology is that if these populations were to breed together, we would still get those intermediate forms. And so something has happened here to really disrupt the population, and it separates our one species into two. And so this is disruptive selection. And that is the end of the part 2 for our lecture on ecosystem diversity and change.